it's interesting how there's going into the ocean and then there's interacting with the environment of the ocean because it's in the air, you know what I mean? And so it's, even when it's just the wind whipping with the salt, it's like you're part of nature in that moment, which is really fun. And there's kind of something fierce about fighting the elements. You know what I mean? Like almost getting blown away. My cape kept picking up the wind and I felt like I was gonna fly off the edge of the... It's all good. So when I was younger, I spent a lot of time at the beach. My family has a place out on Long Island in Casco Bay. I grew up in Maine, and so we would go out there a lot. There's something about the solitude and the isolation that like really gets you in tune with yourself and kind of how you feel about the world. You know what I mean? There's nothing more introspective than sitting with like the sensory overload of just beauty and sublimity. It's like terrifyingly beautiful. And that's the vibe, you know? That's like, if there's one thing that you can harness in life and deliver, that's kind of that ferocity. You know what I mean? That there's no challenging the ocean at the end of the day, right? And when you're queer, that kind of strength really, it gives you the edge to make it in life. I mean, because you do have to fight. And so there's something you have to admire about the fact that nature can be so placid and beautiful on any given day, but you'll never know. There's always the ferocity, the potential for a fighting kind of nature. You really get to feel the strength. I mean, it makes you feel small, but in a way it makes you feel strong. There's this kind of feeling that in going to the ocean and spending all that time, there was a lot of isolation. And I think that if you feel it's a weird thing to say, but if you feel more understood and you have that connection with like the world as it is, because it's not necessarily a cis hetero normative world, but it is, you know what I mean? It doesn't have to be, but because we're culturally here, there's something about being able to break apart from everyone and go be alone with nature that reminds you that the world is for everyone. Nature is for everyone. And that strength has to be appreciated when you're there no matter what. And so I think that in a lot of ways the ocean becomes a relationship. It becomes a social interaction when you're with nature like that. And it's any kind of nature. I mean, everywhere has its different vibes. I mean, you have forests and mountains, and there's nothing like the ocean where it changes. And that kind of fluidity, I think, is so important. And there is a vibe, too, of, I think a lot of people talk about it, like the feminine vibe of the ocean and the moon. And when you, in society, aren't embraced as kind of, for your femininity, being able to connect to something that is like the divine feminine in a lot of ways is so empowering, and there's just no bias in the ocean. You know what I mean? And I mean, granted, there's a whole other side of the ocean too. I mean, it's great to find marine life and to just observe. But there is that connection. There's always that connection. I always say if it was a long time ago, if I was born in the past, I would probably be a sailor. Just because there's this allure to the ocean. And I think back then especially, you didn't have the option to be queer. You didn't have the option to be yourself. And there would have been an escape in that. And there's something comforting in knowing that. And I think that probably pushed a lot of people in the past towards the ocean. I mean, there is that isolation as like being a lighthouse keeper. It's a historic connection that each person gets to build. I mean, there's definitely people who've never seen the ocean, but I think even then they have a connection to it whether they know it or not. So, Yeah, definitely. I mean, being queer forces you to create avenues of feeling accepted, and anywhere you can do that kind of becomes your place. And so for me, that was the ocean. Yeah, and like, not even so much the beach, but like the rockiness, the ledges, the edges, jumping. I remember when I was younger, it was dangerous, but there were a lot of times that I was like testing rocks with my foot before I jumped onto them, like leaping over places, like looking down at tide pools, cutting my feet on barnacles. And there's just that kind of rough, beautiful experience is something I'm so glad that I get to carry with me, even if, the busier you get in life, the more separated you get from that. And it'll always be there. There's always that connection. Yeah. In life, people will tell you you're sassy, or I don't know. There's a lot of different ways that people put down queer people in ways that they don't necessarily come across malicious. But it is malicious in a lot of ways. And so if you get away from that and you recharge yourself and reconnect to yourself, you get to bring that to the community, right? And so with each of us, there's a fear. There's a fear and there's an anxiety in each of us. And we have to be there for each other. And in a lot of ways, we become each other's rocks. But in a lot of ways, we become each other's downfalls. I think there's a lot of that. And unless you can separate yourself from the herd, you can't do anything for the herd. You know what I mean? And we have to stand together and fight. And I think that if more of us kind of took time to introspect like that, it might be better, because we aren't really each other the way that we can kind of meld together. It starts to happen that I think a lot of people feel like they're losing their identities to the masses. And I think that's where a lot of infighting happens too. If a certain queer person identifies a certain way, it doesn't have to affect the entire community. And so when people have kind of like neo-pronouns or different ways of expressing themselves, some people feel threatened by that because they feel like they need to have that same philosophy. But it's really just, the community is the amalgam of each of us, and each of us need to kind of be ourselves. And until we can find that introspection, there's not a lot we can bring to each other's lives, because you have to have that before you can help other people find it. And I think for us, a lot of us are each other's family, and that's what family really needs to do, is stand strong and support each other and not tear each other down or fall into the biases of what other people are telling us to feel. And so cutting off and isolating, I mean, especially if you have something you can connect to that makes you feel strong, is so important.